So now that we've talked in depth about how to observe culture and how to get an idea of what the culture is of an organization, let's talk about how leaders go about embedding a culture, how leaders go about changing an embedded culture. And first thing I want to start off with is, why does this even matter? Why should we be looking to potentially change cultures? And the answer is that when there is a mismatch between personal values and organizational culture, you're going to run into problems. A great example of this that many midshipmen are very familiar with, and this was suggested to me by one of the company officers, was as second class midshipmen change companies in the past, and move from one company to another, or even as anybody in the brigade changes company, what they often find is that they are dealing with a new and different culture. Now, many years ago, when we didn't change companies ever, these cultures really got ingrained, and it was very stark because people would just spend all 4 years in the same company over and over again, and there was no melding of cultures, so no new people coming in other than the new plebes who really get embedded with culture right away. But even after that, there's still, as second class moved after third class year, they moved to a new company. What they often felt was really out of place. And when you feel really out of place like that, it can be hard to get your footing. And part of what was going on there was a mismatch between personal values and really the culture from which those second class were coming and the culture into which they were going. What were the basic assumptions? What were the values? What were the symbols and artifacts and the observable artifacts in this new company that differed starkly from where they were in their old company? That created a lot of angst. It really made it hard for people because they didn't understand that to really get along. So that's a great example of having that mismatch. We talked about when we talked about motivation and how we motivate people. One way that we get people to be motivated towards the things that we want and towards mission accomplishment on our behalf is by having shared values. When every sailor and Marine values honor, courage, and commitment, when ethics is an underlying core of everything that we do, then we have to worry less about making sure people are doing things the right way because they're already ethical people. And so that's the power of having a shared, strong organizational culture that actually supports mission accomplishment and taking care of our people. Is it reduces the amount of time that we as leaders have to spend laying out every single requirement. Where we just have a shared culture of ethics goes a long way. So this is an example, and sometimes it's a matter of changing our personal values, but sometimes it's a matter of changing the culture in which we find ourselves. So we've talked about how to diagnose a culture, how to look at the artifacts, the observable artifacts, how to look at the values, how to look at the underlying organization, and now we're going to look at how to change the culture, or at least attempt to change the culture. It's certainly no easy feat. So again, we have this iceberg idea. And yes, I will say that I am fully aware that artifacts here are spelled incorrectly. I borrowed this slide from someone who does not speak American English and wrote artifacts in this way, but that is neither here nor there. So we have this idea of artifacts, values, and basic assumptions. The flow of culture is from basic assumptions that then inform our values, that then get manifested in these observable artifacts. And so when we're diagnosing, we look at these observable artifacts as indicators of these underlying values and basic assumptions. And the key to changing culture is about changing those basic assumptions. Unfortunately, that's a lot easier said than done. We can't just jump in there and change all the basic assumptions because, come out one new day and say, okay, you assumed this yesterday, you're assuming something else today. That's not how the world works. And in fact, when we're changing a culture, we start with the artifacts. And then we use them to influence values, which we use then to change basic assumptions over time. This is why we have posters around the yard that talk about honor, courage, and commitment. This is why the mission of the Naval Academy is so promptly in places. This is why our logo is in places. This is why we talk incessantly about taking care of your people and about being leaders, because this language, these stories, these artifacts impart values and educate people about values, and they from behind and from underneath, they change people's values, which then in turn change the long-term assumptions that people have. So that's a very slow process, but I want you to understand that's how that process is going to work. You can't just jump in and start changing basic assumptions. You start with the artifacts and you use those to influence values and to influence basic assumptions. Now, listen, as a leader, you influence the culture whether you want to or not. Leaders have an influence on the culture. In fact, I would say that, as it says here, everything a leader does is a communication about culture, whether she means to or not. What the leader pays attention to, what the leader asks about, what the leader measures and controls. Emotional outbursts are part of this. When you get yelled at by a senior officer, and hopefully it doesn't happen very often in your career, maybe once for me over the course of my career, but I remember that, and I knew what that officer wanted from then on. I have used emotional outbursts maybe twice, and when it was a setup with my chief to say, Chief, it's time for an emotional outburst. Sometimes you give what's called the you all speech, where you all need to take a round turn on this. Those emotional outbursts are something that are heavily laden because they're coming from a leader. They actually carry more with them than they would otherwise, and so they are going to embed a certain culture. And even just how leaders react to various things, even if we're not talking about emotional outbursts, just having reactions to critical incidents and defining what is and what isn't a crisis and how we respond to these crises are going to influence the culture over time. Example, when I was a communications officer in my first tour, we used to download our communication security material via phone line when we would pull into port. Yes, I'm sorry, this is before web and all those things. But we pull into port and we'd hook up a phone line and we'd start downloading we'd set up a secure phone line and we'd download communications material. And look, if that didn't work, there were some alternative means. And I didn't think that was a big deal to use the alternative means. So I remember once pulling into a foreign port and was getting ready to use this alternative means. And of course I had to explain to the captain that this was the plan. So I went up to the captain's stateroom and said, sir, just so you know, option 1 didn't work. So I'm going to switch to option 2 in order to download this ComSec material. And the captain just kind of looked at me and said, Kamo, I appreciate that. And I think that's the right decision. We're going to do that. But I have to tell you, if we can't use option 1, we need to go to general quarters and we need to really figure out what's going on with that. And we can't leave it be. And, I had thought no big deal. Walking out of his stateroom, I had a different idea. And I went straight to the XO's office and I went straight to my department head and said, sir, I just want you to let you know, this is what the captain just told me. And this is what we're going to do to start working on it in order to change that. So even though it wasn't a huge critical incident, not necessarily a crisis, the captain's reaction to that changed how I felt about things and how I moved things going forward. And that helped in my unit create a culture around procedural compliance and about it not accepting broken things. So that's an important part of how leaders influence culture. Now, I don't think at the time, if we went to him and said, were you trying to influence culture just then? I'm not sure if he'd say yes or no. He might say, no, I just thought it was dumb and we needed to look into this. But it certainly has that effect, whether we mean to be deliberate about it or not. Same thing, how we allocate resources, where we put our budget. When we say resources, that's money, that's time, that's effort. Where are you having sailors spend their time? Maintenance, training, education, off the ship, on the ship, personal readiness, etc. You don't have time to get everything done. You don't have the money to do it. You don't have the sailors and Marines to do it. Where are you putting these folks? What are you role modeling about your own priorities? As a leader, this communicates about what you believe about culture, and that will again influence the culture. And then of course rewards, promotion mechanisms, who gets ahead, how they get ahead, what we give awards for. These are the types of things that explain what we value and how that affects the culture going forward. We also influence culture by aligning our policy with our design culture, making sure, and again, going back to that discussion about the formal organization, make sure that the formal organizational aspects match to our desired culture. Make sure that the informal aspects, the rites and the rituals, match to that informal culture. Make sure the design of our physical space matches to the culture that we want. The stories that we tell are the stories that are going to influence the culture. Formal statements, organizational philosophy, command philosophy, creeds, charters, the posters that we put on the wall. You've heard me talk about that more than once now. The logos that we create, all of these things are going to influence the culture of your unit. And they're all, you can look at them as levers that leaders can use. None of them is a magic bullet. None of them will immediately change the culture, but there are various levers that you have, tools in your toolbox in order to change the culture of your unit. And again, change is very hard. We're going to talk about how that happens. It's not magic. It doesn't happen overnight, but it is influenceable. And this is one of the primary things that a young JO can do to make sure that they have a good unit.